Political parties seem to be already pronouncing on their preferred coalition partners ahead of this year's local government elections. And judging from South Africa's politics in recent years, coalitions might be the country's norm following the decline of the ANC, which has been in government since the end of apartheid in 1994. The party has been going through a gradual decline in votes from a high of over 60% in previous years to slipping below 50% in 2016 in cities like Tshwane, Johannesburg and Nelson Mandela Bay. As South Africa's official opposition, the DA shows no sign of benefiting from the ANC's limping stature. This has forced political parties to enter in marriage of convenience. Professor Susan Booysen, Mistra Director of Research and the editor of Marriages of Inconvenience, the Politics of Coalition in South Africa, joins us to talk about this dynamic of marriages of convenience, or inconvenience as you've put it. Great to have you, Prof. Thanks so much for being our guest.
Good morning, Leanne. Thank you very much.
So we talk of your book, The Marriages of Inconvenience, the Politics of Coalitions in South Africa. It takes a forward-looking view of the country's politics, but also a historical one. I mean, we couldn't get around to talking about the new book here on the show when it came up, but I think this is the best time to talk about it. So give us a snapshot of the views in this book and these kind of marriages in South African politics.
Mm-hmm. Thank you indeed, Leanne. Yes, and this is the Mapungubwe Institute book that I edit for them. And we really look at from the base of political dynamics in South Africa, and in a way that really relates to your introduction here. We take the African National Congress as the pivot of these coalitions. It is still, in many respects in South Africa, a dominant party system. And it will only change to fuller multipartyism if this ANC starts shedding votes. We know it has started shedding votes, but it is on a jagged curve, uneven, up and down and up and down. But when it comes to local elections, it seems that the curve goes to below that outright 50% in many other cases. So we look at the different metropolitan cases in South Africa. We look at coalitions generally in South Africa and look at the extent to which national, provincial level, national, of course, in 1994, through Government of National Unity, which was a broad, inclusive coalition government in effect, and provinces, Western Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, and then many sites at local government, local municipalities, and the metropoles. And we place this research in African and in global South, global North context, and look at cases where that has become institutionalized coalition governance, in contrast with a party political context that is so characteristic of South African coalition politics. In the book, we also take great notes of the impact that coalition politics has on municipal governance, on the municipal bureaucracies, and see that it is severe impact that it has there. Of course, it's not just coalition governed councils that sometimes have serious problems in governing broadly in South Africa, but coalition governments tend to be even more unstable and unsound in many of the governance aspects than ordinary councils. We also look at the legal context and to what extent the constitution and legislation in South Africa provide for these forms of government. So we take pretty much a comprehensive and comparative view of the options that are manifesting themselves through this local government, new form of local governance, at least for South Africa, and at least the scale. The big difference in 2016, of course, came when the metropolitan councils, at least 4 of them, turned coalition, and therefore a major slice of South Africa's economic activity, etc., suddenly came under coalition government. And we look at what stabilizes and what destabilizes coalition politics in South Africa.
So, I mean, here's the basic question. I mean, that's a great synopsis of what the book focuses on and what it looks at. But I mean, as I think we've all understood now, and we're gathering, is that coalitions are here to stay. That's just the way it is looking with the way South Africans are voting. So my question to you is, are coalitions a good or a bad thing? I mean, or are they just a self-serving exercise for both those parties with enough numbers but actually fail to make the 50+1 requirement, and those parties that consider themselves the power brokers?
Yes, indeed. Coalitions can be and in many ways are a very good thing, because they enable government where legislation, as in South Africa, requires that a governing party must enjoy that 50% plus or an outright majority. And if it does not get to that level, if the voters do not give that kind of mandate, then it is essential that coalitions must be formed in order to constitute a government. And it also can be a wonderful inclusive kind of government that really speaks to nation building and social compacting in a very good, constructive way. The problem is in South Africa, it does not happen this way. Coalition governments are very often seen as another form of contest, as elections by another means. And the great source of instability has been persistent, continuous inter-party contest in the form of coalitions. And here the small political parties, and they are such a big factor, by the way, in the current set of elections, where small parties come in and they exert very often disproportionate power. They are kingmakers or queenmakers and demand high positions, speakers, deputy mayors, mayoral chains often go to small king-making parties. But then often also in the small municipalities, in the so-called local municipalities in South Africa, it just takes one or two of these councillors of the small parties, or sometimes wonderful community parties that really have the interests of communities at heart.
Yeah.
But it just takes one or two of those votes in order to swing the whole council. There have been several cases of serial musical chairs. Now an ANC small party coalition is in power, then a DA small party, and then it switches around again. So it really can be very unstable. And we have seen that there's been such a preoccupation by political parties with these contests and holding power, that governance, developmental, constructive, pro-community governance has often been taking a back seat.
Yeah. I mean, if we look, just let's have a look from the previous municipal election. I mean, we go for a 5-year period between 2016 and 2021. And we saw what happened in Nelson Mandela Bay. We saw what happened in the city of Joburg. We saw what happened in Tshwane. So, I mean, these weren't necessarily successful coalitions, but you obviously know a lot more about them. And I mean, this possibly could be the same way we're heading this year. So what needs to be done differently to actually see success stories coming through?
Such a good question, Leanne. Yes, it's indeed not been good, positive, democratically developmental, etc. governance, so many of these sets, and we seem to be heading that way. First, of course, it makes the results are so uncertain. We've seen several public opinion polls, some better than others, but all of them with big flaws and just unable, I believe, to accurately predict what we are going to see in about a week's time. We know for certain the two biggest parties, ANC and the DA, have both had incredible internal problems. The EFS is growing, but its support doesn't convert into electoral support. And there's this big set of very diverse small political parties, small and very, very small, and new ones that have been coming in. It's not a new thing to have small parties in our politics. Just think back even 2019 provincial and national elections. But they are exerting their new kind of weight in new ways in this election. And so there are community parties that really have a strong local profile and are known and can make a difference. But we do not yet know, and the public opinion polls are not inclusive enough to give us a good sense of how, especially in the last months of campaigning, voter sentiment might have been switching in favor of these smaller parties. So it is an utter situation of uncertainty, not just with the big metropoles, very big and important in South African politics, but also in a host of 205 local municipalities in South Africa where the results are really up in the air, where in a week's time there can be great surprises, but the certain, almost very certain factor is that there will be a continuation of coalition politics, as we see in this book of Mistra's, as also generally between about 27 and 33 coalition governments per local elections since 2000. But given the volatility, instability in the bigger parties, and that they are in all likelihood shedding some votes, even probably not totally disintegrating on their previous performances, but shedding some votes, it can really be, it is a big possibility that will be several more coalitions this time around.
Certainly.
And just to add to your question as to what should be done differently, there are a few things, limited things, but a few things that can be done differently. Just to note, of course, the Constitution of South Africa, it is as if the drafters of this Constitution had not foreseen the day that South Africa would actually come to this point of coalition governments, and that there is just a totally insufficient provision for this form of government. Even in legislation, municipal legislation, electoral legislation in South Africa, insufficient provision. But small things that can be done to stabilize is that parties can be asked, required to draft, not just negotiate thoroughly, but to draft a formal coalition agreement and to be bound by those agreements at least for the bulk of the term until maybe just before a next election.
That actually reminds me of what you're saying. I'm just going to interrupt you there because it was quite interesting to hear just a couple of days ago. I know Terry Tshwane actually came forward and he was a former Deputy Electoral Commission chairperson, and he was basically saying that there actually should be more checks and balances. In fact, he actually went on to say that there needs to be a legislative structure to actually regulate political party coalitions. Could that work? I mean, is that something?
Yes. That's one of the very important points dealt with in chapters and in case study chapters and in the recommendations from this work, is that there should be a formalized, not just formalized agreement with conflict regulation mechanisms incorporated into that, but there should be an oversight body. And I know Terry Tshwane is proposing a type of CCMA, but for coalitions and to monitor coalitions at the local government level. And that could help to stabilize it. And we in this Mistra book definitely agrees on that recommendation. It can go a long way. And there are other places where just changes in municipal legislation could also make a contribution. And here we think, for example, at the municipal executive committees. Here, there are two forms of executive committees, both a proportional committee system and a mayoral executive committee system. Those are both possibilities in legislation. And the mayors, because it gives them a huge amount of local power, and there can be significant power at that level, especially in the metros, excuse me, that they prefer the mayoral executive committee system, where they can appoint executive committee members at will, and very often that becomes a form of patronage to get to small micro parties in order to control big portfolios in municipalities.
Yeah.
And if that is prescribed, that rather the committee system should be followed, then there is automatic coalitions prescribed by the balance of power that the electorate actually gave in their mandates to municipalities. And that could not just be more fair and more proportionately representative, but really a big source of greater stability.
Indeed. I want to just talk about some of the pronouncements that have already been made by different politicians. I mean, we speak about Herman Mashaba. He comes out and says that he would never get into a coalition with the ANC. Helen Zille saying the same thing. EFF's Julius Malema has already assumed to be a key player and power broker, as he is. He's quoted to have said that EFF is likely to play a bigger role in governance after the local government elections. I mean, are these parties becoming more and more brazen, or I suppose wider after the dismal experiences they've had, or wiser, I should say, with the dismal experiences that they've had with one another?
Yes, indeed. You know, on the one hand, I think it is accountable and to be recommended that political parties say up front which other ones they might be entering into coalitions with, because that is the type of mandate in terms of which they will govern. And that is more accountable, that make the voters more aware of what they will be voting for. Not just, for example, think of a small community party. That party may be very powerful, very effective in representing a particular ward. However, they are probably going to be forced to go into coalition with one of the bigger parties, unless it's a small local municipality where they can actually gain an unlikely majority. But they will be governing or giving a power to a bigger party. And this is very important, therefore, that they say, and the bigger parties, yes, they are totally brazen. And we know the last time around, and we do not know why they would really be changing this time around, but the last time around, power really was the central language that was being spoken. When another alliance was possible, for example, here and there, the EFF and the DA had fallouts and those relationships sour, and now they will probably, or at least they say they won't be in a coalition with one another. But there are one or two municipalities around the country where those kind of coalitions, DA, EFF, for example, went to full term. And so we know that political parties are probably going to look at their own interest and how they can gain control over municipalities as the sole criterion when it comes to coalition negotiations. And yes, we'll see whether the last words have been spoken in terms of who they say they will be working with or not.
Anything can change within a couple of minutes in politics, and we do know that, we really do. But I know that we're going to be seeing quite a bit of you next week as well. So we'll be doing lots of analysis and looking at those results coming in and see what our predictions say, because coalition governments certainly look like they're here to stay. And it's going to be interesting to see who keeps the promises of staying away from each other and who actually do jump into bed. So that's going to be a very interesting one. Prof, thank you. Thanks for being with us. Prof. Susan Booysen talking to us about coalitions. She's the editor of Marriages of Inconvenience, the politics of coalition in South Africa, discussing coalitions as an inevitable choice that South Africa will be with for many decades to come. All right. Quick look at some tweets.